Okay, so in this section we're going to talk about further accounts to consider. In particular, we're going to talk about accruals, prepayments and the suspense account. I do see a lot of people sort of struggle with accruals and prepayments, so hopefully I'm going to explain it as plainly as I can. And suspense accounts often causes a few issues as well. So I'm going to touch on accruals first. Okay, so I've got my T account here, I've got my rent account, and I've got my accruals account, and I've got my dead click chart here just so we can refer back to it. So what we're going to assume here is we've got a set of accounts that are dated the year end 31st of December 19. So the accounting year runs from 1st of January 19 to 31st of December 19. And each quarter we pay £1,000 in rent. So quarter one, on the 31st of March we paid £1,000 from the bank account. Quarter two, 30th of June 19, we paid £1,000 from the bank account. And quarter three, 30th September 19, we paid £1,000 from the bank account. Now let's assume we paid these amounts on the day they were due. So we paid that one on 31st of March, we paid that one on 30th of June, we paid that one on 30th September. Now, the rent's £1,000 a quarter, so each accounting year must have £4,000 in rent showing in the accounts regardless, because that's the rent charge for the year, regardless of when the client has paid it. Although most of the time, obviously, the rent will be paid on the due date. But let's say in this example, quarter four, the client missed the payment date. So it was due on the 31st of December, but it was paid on, let's say, the 3rd of January 2020. So we have a problem here, because if it was paid on the 3rd of January 2020 and we enter that in the rent account when it was paid on the 3rd of January, it will not show in the current year. It will show in the next year, because our accounting books run from 1st of January to 31st of December. So we have a potential problem then in the 2019 books. There are only 3 rent payments. And although that's correct, strictly speaking, only 3 rent payments were actually made during the year. Because the rent's £1,000 a quarter and we need to show that whole £4,000 charge in the accounts because that's what's correct, then we have to accrue for the last quarter. So this is how we do that. So as I say, we're going to have to show that last £1,000 due as at the end of December, even though it wasn't paid then. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put Q4 and I'm going to put accrued in there. What I'll do actually is put accruals, just so it's clear. Excuse me, because we've got the accruals account here and that's what we're going to use. So we need to show that £1,000 in there. Now don't forget, rent is an expense. When we increase an expense, which is what we're doing here, it's a debit. So we need to put £1,000 in there. So now the rent account is absolutely correct for the year. It's showing £4,000, which is the charge in rent for the year. But obviously on the 31st of December, this rent wasn't paid. It wasn't paid until 3 days later. So we need to open an accruals account, which I've done here, which is a liability account. And you can see a liability account, when we increase it, it's a credit, and that's exactly what we're doing. So in our accruals account, we're going to need to put Q4-rent, and that's £1,000. So that £1,000 liability, that accrual, will show on the balance sheet as at the 31st of December under liabilities, because we owe £1,000 at the end of the year, at 31st of December, and it was paid on the 3rd of January. So when we come to do next year's books, the 2020 books, 1st of January to 31st of December, when the payment gets made on the 3rd of January, we'll naturally credit the bank account. The bank account's not shown on here, but that will be a credit to the bank account. And the debit will not go in rent, because if it went in rent on the 3rd of January, that would be wrong, because it's effectively relates to the year before. So we need to put that payment into the accruals account as a debit. We're reducing the liability. Remember, increasing liability is a credit, reducing liability therefore must be a debit. So when it's paid to the bank account, or from the bank account I should say, we will debit the accruals account with £1,000, and the accruals account will then balance to 0. So hopefully that's clear. Please do run back through the video to if you don't fully understand that. It's a little bit fiddly to get your head around. But that's accruals done, and in the next stage we're going to move on to prepayments. this time. I've got electricity as an expense, I've got prepayments as an asset account, and I've got the bank account also showing as an asset. So I've got a transaction here. I've got a payment made to our electricity supplier for 900, and as you can see in the electricity account we've got a payment of 900. So I've just entered that in. Now we're going to assume that our books run to 31st of December as in the last example. So as you can see, the payment we made to our electricity supplier, it's for a supply running from November 19 to January 20. So I've made this really easy. So it's for 900. So let's assume that that's £300 per month. So there will be 300 for November, 300 for December, 300 for January. Now obviously our books run up to the end of December, so the January element is not relevant to this set of books. So we're going to have to say we've prepaid 300 for January. So the bank account entry is correct because we paid 900, so we don't need to touch that. The electricity account has been charged with 900 charged. That's not an electricity pun at all, by the way, but it was quite funny. The electricity account has been charged with 900, but 300 of that relates to January 20, which is in our next accounting year. So we need to remove 300 from there to make it correct. So we need to reduce the expense. Now you remember, if we increase expense, it's a debit. We're reducing it, so it's a credit. So I'm going to say prepaid electric 300. So that will then make the electricity account balance out at 600, which is correct because 600 is the element for November and December. We've credited there, so we know we need a debit. Prepayments is an asset account. We're increasing prepayments. Increasing an asset is a debit. So what we're going to do is we'll also put in there prepaid electric, and that's £300. So now the books balance. So at the end of the year, the electricity account is correct. 900 less 300 equals 600. 600 is the element of electricity for November and December. And we have on our balance sheet at the end of the year a prepayment of 300 towards electricity, which is a prepayment towards next year, if that makes sense. Now, of course, when the 2020 books are prepared, we will need to make an adjustment because we will have already prepaid £300 worth of electricity. So in next year's books, we'll need to credit that £300 of prepayment and debit the electricity account for 300 because it relates to the 2020 year. Again, hopefully that makes sense. That's prepayments. The last thing I'm going to look at now is the suspense account. Okay, so finally we're going to look at the suspense account. Now, quite often when a trial balance is prepared, there's often errors in it. And if there are errors, then quite often a suspense account is opened up to try and locate those errors. So I'm going to show you now how to deal with the suspense account if there are problems in the accounts. So in this example, we're going to say there's a trial balance at 31st of December which shows a difference of £77, which is going to be a shortage on the debit side. So I've opened a suspense account, as you can see, and the difference of £77 is entered as a debit on the account, as you can see. So we then discover 3 errors in the accounts. So they all relate to the accounts we've got on screen. So the first error we've got is a cheque of 150 was paid to L. Kent and had been correctly entered in the cash book but had not been entered in Kent's account. So only one side of the entry had been completed. So a genuine mistake. So the bank account, sorry, the cash book was entered correctly, but we've not entered it in Kent's account. So it's a cheque paid to L. Kent, which is a liability. So we're decreasing the liability, so we're not increasing it. So it's not a credit, it's a debit because we're decreasing a liability. So we go into L. Kent's account and we'll put suspense in there, and the difference is 150, like so. So we therefore, obviously, the credit entry has to go to suspense. It was a one-sided entry. The difference would have been entered in suspense. So we then, in here, we put L. Kent 150. Okay. Our second error, we found that the purchases account has been undercast by £20. So there's an error in the addition of the purchases account. It's been undercast by £20. So there's an extra £20 that needs to go into purchases. So purchases is an expense. We're increasing purchases, so it's a debit. So I'm going to put in there suspense account £20, which is the error. And then we'll go up to the suspense account, and obviously the balancing entry is going to need to be a credit. So we're going to put purchases in there, £20. And our last error, a cheque of £93 received from K Sand had been correctly entered in the cash book but had not been entered in Sand's account. So we've received a cheque for 93 which has been correctly entered in the cash book, the bank account, but has not been entered in the debtor's account. So the debtor's an asset. So we're reducing the asset, reducing what K Sand owes the business. So we're decreasing an asset. Now increasing an asset is a debit, we're decreasing it, so it's a credit. So we put that to the suspense account and the amount is £93. So we put the debit side to our suspense account. So we'll say K Sand 93, like so. Now that should be the 3 errors in our books corrected. So the suspense account should now be clear. So if we add those two up, it comes to 170, and we add those two up, it comes to 170. So the suspense account now balances to 0, so it's now clear. So hopefully that's a helpful demonstration of how the suspense account works in your books. So we've now looked at accruals, prepayments and suspense. We've looked at how dead click works. We've looked at a full working double entry example using T accounts. So hopefully that's sort of helped you moving along, understanding how double entry works manually. So that's the end of this section. Hopefully it's been helpful for you. Hope you've enjoyed it. We're now going to move on to our next module.